Story 1. The Shadow in the Forest. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend escape. A group of 4 friends, Sarah, Mike, Rachel, and David, decided to camp in the remote woods of the Appalachian Mountains. The site they chose was well off the beaten path, surrounded by thick trees and the promise of solitude. None of them anticipated the sinister presence that awaited them. The first day was uneventful. They set up camp near a small clearing, pitched their tents, and built a fire. The air was fresh, and the sounds of the forest were a comforting backdrop to their laughter and conversation. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, grew faint, then stopped altogether. The silence was unnerving. As they sat around the campfire, Mike joked, "Maybe the forest is haunted." His comment was met with nervous laughter, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her unease only grew when she noticed how the shadows cast by the fire seemed to move unnaturally, stretching and curling like they had a life of their own. That night, Sarah woke to faint whispers. At first, she thought it was Mike and Rachel talking, but when she peeked out of her tent, she saw them sound asleep. The whispers grew louder, and she realized they were coming from the forest. Grabbing a flashlight, she scanned the tree line. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the campfire's dying embers. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, thin limbs. The figure didn't move, but seemed to watch her. When she blinked, it was gone. The next morning, Sarah told the others what she had seen. Rachel tried to reassure her. "It's probably just your imagination. The woods can play tricks on you at night." But Sarah wasn't convinced. As the day went on, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The others noticed her unease, but dismissed it as nerves. On the second night, the strange noises began. It started with faint rustling in the bushes, then progressed to the sound of branches snapping and heavy footsteps circling the campsite. David grabbed a stick and shouted into the darkness, but the noises didn't stop. They seemed to move closer, surrounding them. The firelight revealed nothing, but the sounds continued. One by one, they retreated to their tents, hoping the noises would stop. By the third night, they decided to leave. As they packed their gear, they noticed odd markings on the trees around their site, deep scratches that hadn't been there before. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The group hurriedly made their way out of the forest, but the feeling of being followed never left them. When they finally reached their car, they found it covered in scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way in. They never went back, and Sarah swears she still dreams of the shadowy figure watching her from the trees. Story 2. The Vanishing Camper. In the summer of 2004, a seasoned camper named Liam decided to spend a week in Yellowstone National Park. He'd been camping alone for years and prided himself on his survival skills. This trip was supposed to be no different. He chose a secluded spot near a river, far from the busy campsites, and spent his days fishing and hiking. But as the days went on, Liam began to notice things that didn't feel right. On the 4th night, Liam woke up to the sound of someone walking around his tent. He called out, thinking it might be a fellow camper, but there was no response. Grabbing his flashlight, he unzipped the tent and looked outside. There was no one there, but the ground around his tent was covered in footprints that hadn't been there before. They were large, human-like, but with an odd shape, as if the toes were elongated. The next morning, Liam decided to move his camp closer to a main trail. That evening, as he sat by his fire, he heard a strange humming sound. It was faint at first, but grew louder and seemed to come from all directions. The sound was unsettling, like a mix of voices and machinery. Then Just as abruptly as it started, it stopped. Liam's unease grew, but he convinced himself it was nothing to worry about. In the middle of the night, Liam woke to find his tent open and his belongings scattered outside. His flashlight, which he always kept beside him, was gone. Panicking, he grabbed his backup flashlight and scanned the area. About 20 feet away, he saw his missing flashlight standing upright on a rock. As he approached it, the humming started again, louder and more disorienting. The trees around him seemed to close in, and the shadows moved in ways they shouldn't. The next day, Liam tried to leave, but the path back to the trailhead was blocked by fallen trees that hadn't been there the day before. As he worked to climb over them, he noticed something chilling. His name carved into the bark of one of the trees, accompanied by the words, "Don't come back." Liam's heart raced as he finally made his way out of the forest. He reported the incident to park rangers, but they found no evidence of anyone else being in the area. To this day, Liam refuses to camp alone. Story 3. The Screaming Lake. In the late 1990, a group of college students decided to camp near a remote lake in Michigan known as Hollow Lake. Local legends claimed the lake was cursed, but the students dismissed it as superstition. The area was beautiful, and they were eager to spend a weekend swimming, drinking, and sharing ghost stories. The first night was uneventful. They swam in the lake, sang around the campfire, and laughed at the absurdity of the local legends. But as the night deepened, they began to hear faint screams coming from the lake. At first, they thought it was an animal, but the screams grew louder and more human-like. Unease settled over the group, but they convinced themselves it was their imagination. The next night, the screams returned, louder and more desperate. One of the students, Mark, decided to investigate. He paddled out into the lake in a small canoe armed with a flashlight. The others watched nervously as his light bobbed on the water, moving farther and farther away. Suddenly, the light vanished, and Mark's terrified screams echoed across the lake. Panic set in as the group called out to him, but there was no response. When dawn broke, they found the canoe washed up on the shore, empty. Mark was nowhere to be found. The local authorities conducted a search, but found no trace of him. The remaining students, traumatized, insisted that the lake had taken him. Years later, campers still report hearing screams at Hollow Lake. Some claim to see a lone figure paddling a canoe across the water, only to disappear when approached. The legend of Hollow Lake lives on, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurk in the unknown.